Hey guys and girls, welcome to episode 12 of the Elite Strength Podcast with Mr. Paul Standell of the Muscle Mentors. We went through a whole stack of biomechanics and physics, basically for strength training. So hopefully you enjoy and get something out of it as much as I did.
Nutrition, lifestyle, and PED education. This is the Elite Strength Podcast with Aaron Scoffey.
Hey guys and girls, welcome back to the Elite Strength Podcast, episode 12 here with Paul Standell of Muscle Mentors. How are you, Paul?
I'm very well, mate. How are we on this? What time is it where you are?
Yeah, it's nearly 10 past 8 p.m.
Oh, wow. It's even later than I thought. It's 10 a.m. here in the UK. So,
yeah,
I'm probably more awake than you are right now.
Yeah, it's not too bad. I know we're going to have a fun conversation, I think, because I think share a very similar opinion on some stuff. So it should be a bit more exciting. Last time I actually did a podcast was with Joe Jeffrey from England there. Right. But it was 6 a.m. here and like 9 p.m. there. So that was interesting. And he'd already dropped the melatonin. Well, yeah, he'd already dropped the melatonin ready to go. He was ready to sleep. So like we were in trouble.
I'm not planning on dropping any melatonin, and certainly not at 10 in the morning. So I think we should be good to go.
we should be good. How was your trip to Dubai before we start? Since we can't travel here in Australia, we can't travel. So we can't do anything. So
where in Australia are you?
I'm in Victoria, the number one state. Yeah. If you haven't heard already.
Australian tourism commercial.
Yes.
Dubai was very nice, mate. It was good to get actually a first little trip I've been able to go on for like 2 years due to the pandemic kind of stuff now. Yeah. So it was a lot of laying around, reading, tanning, a little bit of jet ski, flyboardy, scuba diving kind of bits and pieces, and then lots of nothing, which was super nice. So thanks for asking.
Yeah, well, you've been doing quite a bit of social media content, and your face is popping up all over the Muscle Mentors page and your own page and all over Instagram, going through biomechanics and I guess more so, physics. I would probably put it down to the basis of physics. Good old Newton's law stuff. Instagram.
There's no getting around it, but which, by the way, makes me sound super interesting. He just wanders around saying, "Welcome to Newton's second law."
That's like I always say. Most people would think you get hit by an apple, you just say "ouch," and he's just like, "So, I wonder how that actually happened."
Yeah, exactly. But for me, I got into biomechanics as we will, I'm sure, touch upon. And when you sort of delve into that world, certainly within the exercise world, I think a lot of people end up going down the anatomy side of things. So for me, the way I conceptualize the point of biomechanics is our job really as PTs and maybe as strength coaches is we apply forces to people. In other words, we apply forces to anatomy. And so you probably should know a couple of things reasonably well, forces and anatomy. And a lot of the industry, and certainly the people that, mentored me and what have you, had gone very much down the anatomy side. And you absolutely need to know that. Like if I'm applying a force to a part of your body, I kind of need to know which parts of your body are capable of dealing with that. And that comes down to knowing anatomy. There's no getting around that. But I then started having some more questions about, well, what about this force side of things? Yes, I know something increases or decreases, but I wanted to know how much it increased or decreased. And the answer to those questions, as you say, is found in physics. And then annoyingly, the answer to physics is found in maths. So you pretty much have to go and do a whole bunch of mathematical stuff to start to be able to do it. And, I didn't have a background in that. I was just annoyed that I didn't have an answer. And, I really wanted an answer to some of these questions. And that pursuit of some truth and some knowledge there, if you really care about it, will take you a long way in terms of just being stubborn and being like, right, we've got to learn this. Let's go get after that. So that's probably what some people know me a bit more for is maybe bringing in some of those physics ideas to what we're doing, because physics really is just the study of the world and how it kind of works, right? So that certainly applies to the gym. It's not like gravity stops being a thing in the gym.
Completely agree.
And, or if it did, you'd be lifting monumental loads. You'd look heroic. So if you can lift in a, effectively weightless environment, the gram will look sensational.
Well, I was going to say, but I guess, would you actually accrue those adaptations?
No, you wouldn't. But for the temporary, but for a temporary, image on Instagram, doesn't matter.
Yeah. No, exactly.
You just need to get into space for a little bit, just a bit of time in orbit. Have a crap load of weights there, make it look like you're benching giant loads, and then come back down to earth before the negative adaptations kick in, and you've got the best of both worlds. Awesome pics for the gram.
And without the side effect of
death. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, gotcha. So I guess, would you say when it comes to muscle mentals, again, myself and a lot of the guys that I think listen, and girls, I guess, that listen to this podcast do follow the muscle mentals. I've sort of followed their stuff for a while and, plug them as much as I can. When I look at like Luke and Callum and the stuff that they were posting, even James, he sort of touched on a bit of, I guess, biomechanics-y, but would you say that you sort of brought the physics back to strength training, especially with those guys, having a different sort of look where it was sort of just another aspect or another part of the scope?
Yeah, possibly.
Yeah, just when I think of the guys that are there, yeah, because like I said, I've followed them for a long time as well. I just haven't seen the physics application more so.
To be fair, I was a member of the Muscle Mentors portal and was learning from the boys before I joined the team. Yes. And that's kind of what I mean by I started having some questions that weren't really answered, whether it's from Tom Purvis in the RTS or Michael Goulden, who runs Integra in the UK, or some of the other boys in the Muscle Mentors. I was like, I'm still missing some of the answers that I wanted to stuff. And that kind of led down the physics route. And then as I was putting more of that stuff out, Luke was like, dude, can you run me through some of this stuff? Like, I'd like to kind of know that shit. So I started sort of mentoring Luke through some of the more physics side of stuff. Mm-hmm. And it was, that really was what sort of brought me onto the team of kind of going, I'd been on a bunch of courses, the same courses with Luke and Jimbo in particular, that we'd been on together. I'd been on their kind of stuff as well. And I was like, okay, we could bring this in, and started walking them through actually what those numbers would be and what they would mean and what have you. And clearly we all have a shared love of wanting to know more and explore these topics and improve what we do as trainers. Because that's really what it comes down to. No one, like when you're in with a client, no one cares about the numbers, right?
Yeah, like, for sure.
That's not what you're there to do. You're not there to start boring them about, the conservation of energy or momentum. That's not going to be what you do. But an understanding of some of these concepts start to inform, well, why might I want to go a bit slower on this move, but I could allow myself to go a bit faster on this one? Or, how big a difference does it make if I was to just effectively drop the load into the bottom position of this thing versus if I slowly kind of lower it? The answer to those questions are found in physics. And I think as coaches, we at least want a rough appreciation of them. We're never actually going to know the precise answers because we're not going to have precision methods of measuring half of those bits in order to give us an answer. So it's more of an overarching concept of what does it mean when I move this object round an arc that's on a big arc versus a small arc, or it's on a pulley system that's got a 1-to-1 ratio versus a 4-to-1 ratio. What does that mean for what we can start to do to those loads? And I went kind of, even things will come across. Some of you guys and girls, if you've been in the biomechanics world, you might hear things like on different leg presses, when they're on different slopes, you're dealing with a different percentage of the load that is on the leg press, right? So you might hear generally the two that get thrown out. If you're on a 30-degree incline on a leg press or hack squat, you're dealing with 50% of the load. And if you're on a 45-degree, you're dealing with about 71% of the load. And I'd heard these terms and they're kind of thrown around, but I was like, why? Why those numbers? And again, the answer for those gets found in physics. It's called an inclined plane. We end up having to get Pythagoras out and learn this thing called a sine function. What the fuck is that? And I was like, I never thought I'd end up using SOHCAHTOA, the trigonometry,
the good old days
kind of things. I was like, shit. Turns out I'm using these. Okay.
Yeah.
And it's a really I think empowering part of if you are a trainer with some of this stuff, because one of the nice things about physics is it's much more black and white. And so much of training is up for debate, and it's kind of nuanced, and there's a person in front of you and they have their likes and dislikes and whoever they are. And so often there's no hard and fast right answer. how exactly you go about communicating or coaching the person in front of you is going to be dependent on if they're a Marine, if they've got some kind of disordered eating background, if they've just got into the gym, if they're older or younger, and what their personality is like. And okay, great. Bloody hell, there's so many things about them. There's no right answer. And that takes time to be comfortable with the gray and the nuance. And one of the really nice things about some of the physics stuff is there's not really that much gray. This is your answer. You're either right or wrong. I don't care about your opinion. And sometimes that's really nice to just be like, I think this is the answer. Is it the answer? Yes. Cool. And there's a confidence in that. So that if someone challenges you on that idea, you're like, be my guest. I will stand up here in front of anyone you like and go, no, that's the answer. We could test it with a little experiment and you will find out that I am correct. And it's not because I am correct, it's because that's what the physics is. And I think that's
totally fair.
And we can use little things in the gym. I'm forever getting, luggage scales, or we use a thing called a crane scale. You can get these things off Amazon for anywhere from $5 to 40 quid if you're in the UK. I don't actually know what the
I think it's about 15 to about $60 Australian, give or take.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So you can get these bits and pieces, and you've done you think that's what it is, and maybe you've learned to analyze a machine, and you're like, okay, so I think this has these things we call moments or moment arms. So if we're when we're in the gym, if you imagine we're on a leg extension, well, that leg extension rotates. So rotating things have their own physics, right? So there's a weight on the stack that somehow gets translated to the weight that meets your leg via the engineering of the machine. And I'm pretty confident most of you guys, and I keep saying guys and girls for some treasure in this, we'll just show it to most of you guys listening to this, will have been in the gym and you'll have used one leg extension. And let's say normally you put 50 kilos on that leg extension. And then you go to a different gym, you're on holiday or you're just at a different gym, and you go to the leg extension, and you're like, I know I use 50 kilos, and you put 50 on it, and it either feels stupidly light or stupidly heavy, and you're like, why? It's 50. It says 50 and I do 50. Why is this different? Or maybe it's a lat pull down, or who knows what. And the answer is because you're not actually lifting just the stack. That stack has to come round, go round a few bits and pieces, depending on the machine, and ultimately meet my leg. And one of the things that really matters with rotation is the force, which is, we're going to say, the weight on the stack. Effectively, it's being accelerated by gravity. Let's ignore that for now. Let's just call it the weight on the stack. Right? No one's going to talk in newtons. Like, no one goes to the gym. How many newtons split today? No one's right?
It'd be kind of cool if someone did that, right?
Yeah, exactly. It'd also give you a much bigger number, so you just sound heroic.
Yeah, exactly.
I did 400,000 newtons today. Jesus. But then there's this distance concept. So if you were to keep in your mind's eye, if you're thinking of a dumbbell lat raise and you hold that dumbbell just by your side, you can kind of hold that dumbbell down there forever. Or maybe not forever, but for a really long time. There's not really a challenge. Yep. Yeah, there's not really a challenge to your shoulder there. Your grip might start tiring if it's a heavy enough dumbbell, or maybe your trap gets tired. But as far as your delt goes, your shoulder goes, there's nothing going on. Yeah. And yet when you take your arm all the way out to the side and you would just hold it out to the side, it's suddenly really challenging. It's really demanding. And I was like, I remember having this question posed to me, like, why is the lat raise hardest out to the side? And I was like, I don't know. And I was like 8 years into being a PT. And I was like, I should be able to answer that question, shouldn't I? Because, well, did the dumbbell get heavier as I took it out to the side? Well, no, the dumbbell didn't suddenly increase in mass. I wasn't holding a 10 kilo dumbbell. And then when I held it out to the side, it suddenly transformed in my hand to a 30 kilo dumbbell. That hadn't happened. Has my arm increased in mass? No, it's the same mass. So what is this? Well, it turns out there's this distance that force is relative to an axis, a thing that's spinning around, or this thing is spinning around, just like a door. A door has a hinge. And we don't put the handle for the door right next to the hinge. We put it at a distance because it'd be weird and it'd be a crap way of opening a door to have this whole door. And you've decided, I'm not going to put the handle at the far end of the door. I'm going to stick it right there.
Right, yeah.
Exactly. So that your leverage over the door is shit. Now you put it at the far end of the door. If you use a crowbar, you stand at the end of the crowbar.
Yep.
We're talking leverage, really. And we're talking leverage over a pivot point or an axis, a thing that really we can rotate around. And in the arm here, the shoulder, That's the bit I'm spinning around. And this load, when I take it out to the side, it increases the distance it effectively is away from that shoulder, which means it increases its leverage. And suddenly that load times that distance, that creates the challenge. And we call that torque. Torque is just a force at a certain distance. And that's what it turns out we're lifting. And so we come back to the leg extension, and that 50 kilos on the stack isn't what we're lifting. We're lifting a torque, which means really we're lifting that load times some distance that thing is away from the axis of the machine, in this case, the bit that it spins around. You know, that bit you're trying to line your sort of leg up, your knee up with the axis of the machine. I'm sure most people have at least have some familiarity with trying to kind of do that, or they've been told by a fitness instructor, whatever. It's the same principles and it's the same ideas. And so how much we're actually lifting, again, comes down to some of these physics ideas. And we start to bring them in and go, cool, I can answer these questions now. I can say why on one leg extension I can lift this weight, and on another I can lift that, rather than I don't know.
Yeah, for sure.
And again,
an actual answer for the client, right?
Yeah. And then you can take things like your crane scales, and maybe you've learned how to assess it and analyze a machine, but are you right? And the really nice thing with this stuff is you can then test it. You get your little method to pull on this thing and go, I reckon with that 50 kilos, and I've assessed where it goes around these pulleys and how it comes into this axis, and it's got this certain distance, and I've got a certain distance the other side. I reckon I'm going to have to pull here with 60 kilos equivalent, let's say, for the 50. And then you get your scale out, you pull on it, and you go, what did I get? And if you have to only pull with 30 to move it, you were really wrong.
Yes.
your analysis clearly wasn't right. You missed something, which is cool, because then you get to learn something. Exactly. But if it was there or thereabouts, you're like, I got that right. And again, it's going to be there or thereabouts, because there's these invisible things like friction in the pulleys that you're not going to be able to fully assess. And there's going to be things like the weight of the metal in the machine that you can't really weigh before it's on. So you're going to be ballparking it, and that's okay. And, you know, you're also going to need to ballpark it, because when you move the object, when you start actually going through the rep, force isn't static. When you move, and if I was to hold a tennis ball or something and I throw it up into the air, I generate a bunch of force initially to get that thing going. But after that, it's now traveling. And until gravity slows it down and eventually turns it back around, how much more force do I need to keep applying to it? None. Potentially, it's already going up. And it's going to take some time before that slows down. The same is true when we start lifting things in the gym. When we go back to that lat raise, you know, people launch their arm up for a reason. It's because it decreases the load that's effectively on me at the top of the lat raise. That's why, you know, if you hold your arm out there and just do like an isometric with it, you're never going to do anywhere near the same amount of weight that people do when they're in the gym and they're going, and throwing it from the hips and really trying to launch that guy. So force itself isn't static. So even if you had analyzed the machine, you were bang on the money, well, the speed of the rep is also going to affect how much force is applied to me at different points through the range, through this machine or through this exercise. So again, we just want to be nearby. If we're kind of nearby with our ideas and what's going on, that's going to be sweet. That's going to be what we take into the gym and what we start applying to either ourselves or our clients.
Yeah, no, it's totally fair. And again, something I completely agree with, and something I dived back into, obviously, as of late, back into biomechanics and trying to understand that. So I guess when we look at biomechanics versus physics, obviously, of a lot of crossover, a lot of similarities, yet similar, I guess, a little difference as well, right? So when we look at actual biomechanics we'll keep it in the gym, obviously, for, example's sake, make it easy for ourselves. I guess what's some examples of biomechanics or things that we'd use from a biomechanical perspective when we look at machines or when we look at exercise selection and that sort of thing?
So where do we, so can you phrase that question again for me? So where are we starting to look at?
So if we're looking at things like a leg press, leg extension, I guess the application of biomechanics versus physics. So like you said, using physics in terms of, using a fulcrum and all that sort of stuff, where biomechanics has that crossover. But I guess when we look at that differentiation.
Cool. So the physics bit really is, that's the bit that before we even meet the human, right? That's the forces side of this equation. We said that it's forces meets anatomy. Yes. So, my body is responding to the physical world. It evolved in the physical world, and that physical world is described by the language of physics. So if we're going to talk about, well, why should my body recruit my delt? Well, the answer is there's clearly a challenge that is causing or would cause some motion around the shoulder that the delt is well aligned to deal with. Yes. Then we have to start taking those forces and start bringing them into the body. How and what torque is created by that line of force to the different joints of me. So if I'm on a leg press and this thing is coming down a slope, and so I'm dealing with a percentage of the load that is dictated mainly by the angle of the slope. The more upright it is, the closer to just sheer vertical, the more of the weight I'm dealing with. The closer to horizontal it gets, the less load in plate terms that I'm dealing with. And this will be one of the reasons why people can go in the gym and on some leg presses or some hack squats, they chuck a shitload of plates on, and then others, they need far fewer. It's just related to the slope effectively. Yes. But then we've got different things within, let's take a hack squat. The angle of the foot plate is going to affect how well you fold up underneath that particular load. The relationship between things like your femur length relative to the length of your tibia or the length of your torso is going to affect that. We've also got some optionality within where we shove and push on the foot plate and where we shove and push on, let's say, the pads that we push our shoulders up into on the hack squat, or the back pad part of it as well. I tend to think of this as being a bit like an accordion. There's these two forces that are trying to come together and I'm in the middle of them. So generally when we look at this, we draw this sort of line of force between almost the two contact points. Let's say it's my shoulders and the middle of my feet. And those 2 points are going to come together, and we can draw from there how effective these lines of force are at turning my knee or my hip or my vertebrae or whatever joint we're starting to look at within these guys. And we can then go, all right, how big a challenge to those tissues does it present? But how big a challenge it presents is still going to vary. We'll pick some arbitrary numbers here and say we've got 100 units of a turning force thing, of a torque thing that's being applied to the knee and to the hip. I've got equal distances between my line of force to the hip and the knee. Does that mean I've got an equal challenge for the hip and the knee? Well, not necessarily, because is the force production capacity of those two different joints the same? If I present 100 units of a challenge to a joint that can only itself produce 120 units, and then on the other joint, I presented this 100 unit challenge, but it can produce 200 units, that's not the same challenge for those guys. One of them, it's much closer to its capacity, and the other one's got a fucking shitload left in the tank. And so the challenge this presents, even if they look equal from the physics perspective, doesn't mean they are equal from the reality of your experience. There's also going to be things, if you guys have never come across a guy called Jacques Newell-Taylor, he runs a thing called the Exercise Design Lab. Also has a strong biomechanics RTS kind of background, but a big neurophysiological background as well. And so starts to bring in what can we take from the nervous system and our understanding of how it works when we start applying these forces to it. And, one of the things you'll find is that when we apply a force, let's say to the knee there, and it's trying to bend my knee so my quads have to work, that your nervous system has a bit of an ability to cycle between quad output. So for a certain period of time, it might decide that your vastus medialis is the guy that's going to use a bit more. And then the lateralis will get involved. And maybe now it's a bit more rec fem. And actually it has the ability to orchestrate slightly differently under these things. So even if we'd lined everything up really well and we had our excellent fucking setup for this exercise, there's still some inherent variability underneath there that your body can respond to. We can limit it, and it's still always responding to the physical reality of the challenge we're placing onto it, which is physics again. But it's not a hard and fast, purely robotic answer. We've got some wiggle room in those guys and girls. So even if we've set up and understood our physics, we still have to understand that it's meeting a person. And then even within that person that it's meeting, well, how do they relate to these things? If we're thinking of, has someone got an injury history? Like the back is the most obvious one, right? I can't remember who said this line, and I wish I could because I would credit them. But if you can go in as a trainer and you make the front of someone's core ache, they will think you're a genius. They're going to be like, I'm going to have a six-pack by yesterday. It's going to be phenomenal. Take more of my money. And yet, if you go in and you make the back of their core ache, the musculature not on the front of the spine, but on the back of the spine, like, oh my God, this person is a liability and a danger to society. I'm never coming again and I'm suing you. And yet, was there really much different between those things? No, I created a forced demand to some of those tissues that they had to deal with. They weren't used to dealing with them. They got a bit sore. Then they related to this soreness in a different way. One of them is it's threatening. One of them is it's moving me towards my goals of having a six-pack and getting laid at the beach, right? But that's a different thing. That's psychological. And we have to appreciate that, because look, you can't, especially with the back stuff, and someone has a history of spinal issues or back pain, you can't just tell someone to get over that. That's not how fears of things work. Like, plenty of people understand that. I mean, you live in Australia, so there's a legitimate fear for spiders. But in the UK, we got nothing, right? There's no good reason to be afraid of a spider here. Nothing's going to happen. We got a thing called a daddy long legs. That's as bad as it gets. If you've never looked at daddy long legs, yeah, check them out. But you guys have some legit reasons, right? But over here, plenty of people are going to have a fear of some spiders, even though nothing really happened. And they might rationally understand that, yeah, nothing bad is going to happen from this spider or clowns or pigeons or whatever fucking weird thing it is that you've got your little fear about. But that doesn't stop your emotional reaction to it when you find yourself in those spaces. A bit like, have you ever gone on any of the virtual reality stuff? Because it's a bit of a head fuck if you haven't.
No, I actually haven't, to be honest, yeah.
It's a cool experience for that. Like, part of your brain knows you're in VR. Of course it does. You've stuck the headset on. You were there.
Yeah.
You chose to put this thing on. And yet now you're stood on this giant ledge, miles up high, like, fuck. And you have to walk across a small plank of wood. There isn't a plank of wood, right? You're on a flat floor. It's not going anywhere. But your brain doesn't care. As far as it's concerned, it's getting some input that's like, good Lord, we're up high. Yeah. And you're sort of playing with that. And we have to accept that. And it will take some time to acclimatize for us to change these relationships where, okay, let's maybe expose my client to a smaller force in some of these tissues that I know they are a bit wary of, they've got a history of, and let's build their confidence alongside that. Because one of the realities of training something is, if I decrease their incidence of pain, and I get them stronger within that, was it the fact that they got stronger that decreased the pain? Or was it the knowledge that they could do something and it didn't cause them pain that decreased the pain? I don't know. And it sort of doesn't matter. And it's a bit impossible to untangle those two things from each other. But the point is, I did this to my client, and over time, through exposure, graded and sensible exposure, they overcame their thing. And that usually takes a good few months. It's not going to happen in one session. You're going to have to be a little bit. And then they realize nothing terrible happened. Okay, let's nudge that a little bit further. Nothing terrible happened. Or we nudge it a bit further. Oh, they got a little niggle. Cool. Let's ease it back, and let's cool. Then we come back another time. And we just repeat this process. And over time, it's fine. And the toolkit to allow you to do that is part psychological. And then the other part is biomechanics. It's, how do I adjust these forces and understand where they're being applied to you? Okay, that exercise has much more of a torque demand on those spinal erectors than this exercise, even though both exercises train the arse. If they're wary about their spine, which one should I pick at this particular point? Maybe this guy. And then nudge them along and build their competence, build their confidence, build their strength, all of those things. So with the realm of physics, yeah, it tells us what we're dealing with, but the human still meets it. And then there's a bit of neuro stuff that's going to affect, you know, what our body chooses to use in order to do that within reason. It can't use things that aren't lined up at all, right? If I apply a force to your elbow, you can't use your quad to fight it. That's just not going to happen, right? It has to be related somehow and have some ability to fight that guy. But there's a bit of variability in that. And then there's definitely this whole other human side within it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, totally fair. And like I was sort of trying to get across without sort of asking is like the human aspect to it. It's like, yeah, physics is one thing, but biomechanics is physics with humans, which is interesting. Yeah. And like we were sort of talking off camera, a lot of the biomechanics stuff is taught to field-based sports really, and team sports. And it's just, there's not much education when it comes to being in a gym. So, and, you know, basically with PTs and just wanting to get bigger or stronger or leaner or, you know, I guess all the above.
Yeah, there's been this like history of biomechanics has generally been applied to sprinters and javelin throwers and the athletic population. And oddly, it sort of left the PT stuff behind, even though anyone going into the field, there's way more money in PTing the general population than there is in trying to deal with that elite 1%. And the cash that's allocated to be an elite strength coach for most of these sports is minuscule. Most of these athletes themselves don't get paid anything. If you're dealing with an Olympian, they're on minimal cash. Yeah. They're dealing with government grants or sporting grants from various things that are funding that, and the coaches get even less. So there isn't really that thing going on, but it does seem to have had this history. And so the people who go into it are influenced by what their professors are interested in and studied themselves. And a lot of these guys and girls were themselves athletes. Mm-hmm. And so they keep studying the field that they were in. And then the people who learn from them by proxy study the field that the professor was interested in. And we get this kind of, bubble forming. And then some of us who want to get into this because we're actually more interested in the gym side of things kind of go in. You're like, I'm excited to do it. And then there's none of it's covered. There's no real consideration of these bits and pieces, which was a big shame, but I suppose leaves a nice gap in the industry. If the other way of looking at it is there's opportunity where there isn't something being served yet. And so it's, how do we bring that stuff in and meet the person who is in front of us? And some relatively basic bits and pieces in biomechanics will go a long way. Like on one level, biomechanics for the gym stuff, it's way simpler than the biomechanics of analyzing a discus throw. Way simpler. We're just trying to think almost in static positions. What's the challenge being exposed to this joint for this person with this machine or this exercise right now? When you start looking at someone traveling at really rapid speeds and rotating and hitting the floor here and there, the calculations for those things get astronomically annoying. Yeah. And we don't need all those bits and pieces, which is cool, which is also why it's a bit mind-blowing to me that there isn't anyone serving this field. It's way simpler in many senses than the biomechanics that's done at the university level.
Yeah, the movement mechanics really isn't as complex as field-based athletes or even Olympic sports and that sort of thing.
Yeah, so, it's not even close. And yet, here's the other weird part of that, though, is that then there's almost two worlds in the research. There is biomechanics for athletes, and then there's like hypertrophy research and stuff going on in a completely different realm, and never the two meet. So when we look at the hypertrophy research, or whatever kind of research you want to look at in the gym sense for general population, for people who just want to look better naked, not athletes, there's never an evaluation really of the biomechanics involved. There's certainly never a breakdown of the forces that this machine presents to this person at this position, and this position. They just say things like, this is a leg curl, this is a leg extension. As though all leg curls and leg extensions are the same.
It's the same, yeah. I agree. It's something that I've questioned a few times in the past with research. It's like, especially more so in the hypertrophy side of research. It's like, especially doing leg extensions, because it seems to be that's what everyone likes to do research on, because apparently that's the best thing to do. And it's just an
easy thing to put people in. Like, we'll do that one.
Yeah, and it's just like, well, okay, which machine did you use? Did you use the same machine every time? Like, but then they try to replicate the research. It's like, well, did you use the same machine or did you use a different machine? No. It's always different. So
a study came out this year looking at seated leg curls versus prone leg curls. I just put out a video this morning.
Yeah, I saw that.
It was like a 10-minute one looking at the conclusion from this: seated leg curl, prone leg curl. So we're training the hamstrings and we're training them at different lengths. So your four hamstrings, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. They're on the inside of the leg. And then you have these two heads of a thing called your biceps femoris, a short head and a long head. All of them cross the knee. So they can all bend your knee, flex your knee. The short head of biceps femoris doesn't cross the hip, just attaches onto the leg, the femur. And so it's only interested in the knee. Doesn't matter where your hip goes, has no effect on biceps femoris short. But the long head, as well as the two semis, which always sounds like you're making some kind of penis reference, and I enjoy that, right? They're affected by where we put the hip. So if we wanted to fully shorten those three heads of the hamstrings, we have to bend the knee, fully flex the knee, and what we call extend the hip, push the hip forwards into its, like as you would if you were just stood bolt upright in an RDL or a squat or the top of the hip thrust position, whatever. Hip extension plus knee flexion. That is maximal shortening of the hamstring. If we wanted to maximally lengthen these 3 heads, we do the opposite. We straighten the knee and we flex the hip. So in a seated leg curl, you're at a hip flex position and your leg can go straight. So you can get into the fully lengthened position for the hamstring. In the prone leg curl, your hip is ideally extended and your knee comes all the way back. So we can get into the fully shortened position. So this particular study went, well, let's study the seated leg curl versus the prone leg curl and see which one's better for muscle growth, which is a perfectly reasonable question to ask. But there's no analysis of the machines in it. So does this machine, just because you put 50 on the stack, as we just touched on, doesn't mean I'm dealing with 50 when it meets me. And it certainly doesn't mean it as I go through a range of motion. Because it might give me 50 at the start of the movement and give me 30 at the end of the movement. Or it might give me 50 at the start and 50 at the end, or who knows what. There's a whole range of possible options. And if you don't standardize that, you can't draw really any conclusions from what's going on. Because, well, if we're trying to study something in science, the whole aim is that we hold, ideally, in a perfect world, and obviously we're humans, so it's never perfect, but we try for this. We hold we hold everything consistent, but one variable. Yep. We try and then just see if I just change this one variable, what happens to the outcome? And so one of the variables in this study is hamstring length. Of course it is. Cool, that's a cool thing to study. But if we're not standardizing these force outputs, how can I conclude? So the study concluded that the longer muscle length, training the hamstrings in the seated leg curl, led to more growth than the prone leg curl. And perhaps that's right. Perhaps it is the muscle length change that is responsible for the difference in outcomes. But the primary driver of muscle growth seems to be mechanical tension. And mechanical tension is responding to the force being applied to us. But if we didn't standardize the forces across the ranges between these conditions, well, then how can I conclude that it's the difference in length that is responsible for that? You can't. It might turn out to not matter. That's always the possibility. But again, we have to have that humility to go, we haven't concluded. And that's not that complicated a thing to consider, really. Like when you look at what goes on at the PhD level, the analysis of the biochem within that stuff is mind-boggling and hurts, right? And you're like, okay, so you can consider all that. Yeah. But we couldn't just measure some fundamental torques in this position and this position. Yeah. And you know, we've got some other considerations within there as well. We may as well touch on while we're there. Okay, so how much does the force change? How much does my force change as I go from one position to another? So let's say I was at the start of the seated leg curl with my legs straight, and we strapped you in, and you had to just produce force against an immovable object, and we measured how much force you could produce there. And then we bring your leg back to the 90 degrees, so the back of the seated leg curl, the shortest position it gets to in that. And then we do the same thing. How much force can you produce in that? And then we measure what's the difference between those two positions. And perhaps we find that when your leg's straight, you can produce 50 kilos of force. And when your leg is bent in the seated version of this, you can produce 35 kilos of force. Cool. Yeah. It dropped off by 15 kilos. Whatever percentage, 30% drop off that ends up being kind of thing. And then we look at, well, does the machine give you a similar thing? Does the machine drop off by about 30% or 15 kilos, if that's what we were putting on there? If it does, sweet, we've got this thing we're going to call, this gets called a congruent profile. Congruent just means in harmony. The profile, we're talking about two different things. What's the profile of the machine and the resistance it gives us? And what's the profile of my strength output? So if I've got a machine that gives me 50 kilos where I can produce 50 kilos and 35 kilos where I can produce 35 kilos, I've got this in harmony, this congruent profile between the challenge. Every point in that rep is a bitch and really difficult, as opposed to, you know, if we had something that I could deal with 35 kilos at the back, I'm going to have to only put 35 kilos. If it gives me the same throughout the whole range, let's say it gives me 35 when my leg is straight and 35 when my leg is bent, well, I can't put 50 on there because I'd never get it to the back position. So if I wanted to use the full range, I'm going to have to be limited by that point where I'm weakest if the machine doesn't change to reflect that. And so, cool, I might have to put 35 on there because I'm going to get 35 when my leg is bent and I'm pulling it back. But then there's not going to be anywhere near an appropriate challenge when my leg straightens out a little bit and my force capacity goes up, but the exercise resistance doesn't go up to meet that. So we'd want to take that into account. And then we bring that into the prone leg curl and we reanalyze and we go, okay, in this different muscle length, what's my force output now at the top and the bottom? And again, what's the exercise give me relative to those guys?
Yeah.
And there is literally zero consideration of this in the research. It's not mentioned at all. It just says seated leg curl, prone leg curl.
What's even more funny is those actual machines exist for leg extensions. And in the research, it's been shown for, I think it's passive and active forces that they hooked up for leg extension. They checked force output and then hooked them up to they actually put electrical currents through their quads to see if they could generate some more force. And what do you know?
Yeah, so it's called a strength deficit, right? So if you ever look at the research on this, what they end up doing is they will strap people in like they're about to be launched into space, right? So there's like a rally car harness going around, there's seat belts around, everything is strapped down as hard as it can. And the reason for that is the more things your nervous system has to juggle from a stability perspective, the lower it lets you put your force output at, right? So stabilization is super important if you want to maximize force output. Cool. So strap everything down, sweet. And then we measure, let's take the leg extension, because that's what we're talking about. And let's say we're at the start position of the leg extension, about 90 degrees-ish or wherever that happens to be for you. And again, we get you to shove as hard as you possibly can against the pad, but we've put it to a machine where you'd have to come up with 1 million kilos of force to get it to move anywhere. You're never moving it. It's, for all intents and purposes, immovable. You shove. You measure how much force is produced. Cool. We then go and just bypass you by electrically stimulating that quad directly and going, and we call this maximum voluntary isometric contraction and maximum involuntary isometric contraction. And there is a difference between these two positions. You cannot produce as much force voluntarily as you can when someone else just electrocutes you with a cattle prod, right? You can produce more force when we skip you. There seems to be this inhibition effect, and we call this the strength deficit. And it's potentially protective. It's potentially a skill-based kind of thing. It varies muscle group to muscle group. Generally, the bigger the muscles, the bigger the strength deficit. So the quads, classically, it's somewhere around 15-ish% between what you can produce and what you could actually produce if you were just electrocuted to fuck. Whereas things like the elbow flexors, the biceps, only about 5%. And the dorsiflexors, when you pull your toes towards your shin, about 2%, small gaps. And this turns out to matter if you're actually trying to grow muscle, by the way, because so I don't know if people listening to this will be familiar with motor unit recruitment. And if not, I can waffle a bit about. So if we're trying to train a muscle, we first have to turn it on. Like it's going to be difficult to do anything to it if it's not active. So the first bit is, how do we activate it? And we call these things motor units. And a motor unit is a motor neuron, essentially the wiring that goes from your brain and nervous system down to the light bulbs that wiring turns on. The light bulbs in this instance are muscle fibers. So within a muscle, you've got shitloads, literally thousands of potential muscle fibers attached to it. And motor units don't have the same number of muscle fibers attached to them. So they actually increase. So motor unit 1 might only contain something like 20 fibers. And let's say this hand muscle, because this is the one I've got in my mind, has 120 motor units, but the 120th motor unit contains like nearly 18,000 muscle fibers. Motor unit 1 has 20, motor unit 120 has 18,000. So if we turn those two on, and we could only turn on one by themselves, which isn't going to happen, right? But we could only turn on the first motor unit. I'm only training 20 muscle fibers. So even if I stimulated growth there, it's in a very small number of fibers. If I could stimulate growth in that 120th motor unit with 18,000 muscle fibers, I'm going to see potentially a lot more growth because, well, there's just a lot more fibers attached. I can increase muscle protein synthesis and I can do those things to those guys. So this thing called motor unit recruitment talks to us about this process of turning on all these fibers. And we see this exponential increase in the number of fibers attached to the motor units as you go up. And as we go up the motor units, essentially we just need a bigger and bigger electrical signal to turn them on, right? So, and anytime we send a big enough electrical signal to turn on motor unit 120, it is by definition big enough to turn on all of the others. So we have this thing called the size principle, the Henneman principle, which says we don't recruit motor unit 4 till we've recruited 1, 2, and 3. We don't recruit 10 till we've recruited all 9 before it, et cetera, et cetera. And so a consequence of this exponential increase up a curve is that the last 10%-ish of the motor units contain more than half of the total muscle fibers involved. And so if that's the case, well, I best turn those fuckers on if I'm trying to maximize growth. And if we've got this big strength deficit, 15% or so, maybe I'm leaving a bunch of those motor units on the table and therefore leaving my capacity to grow a little bit on the table. And one of the things that closes the strength deficit is familiarity with training. If you're constantly changing your exercises, you ain't going to be spending enough time to have the skill to do that exercise well enough to have a smaller strength deficit between the voluntary and the involuntary. Then there's other things like how stable is the exercise. On something like a leg extension, we could probably close that gap faster than an Olympic snatch, or certainly a front squat or a back squat and all that stuff. So what's the skill demand of the exercise in question? What's the size of the muscle tissue in question? We touched a little bit on that nervous system's ability to modulate who's fighting it. That's probably going to play a role in here as well. But these are things we certainly want to start to consider, because even if we've understood the physics, right, this is the forces I'm exposed to, there's all this physiology underneath it that's also playing a role. And so I want to start understanding, how do I maximize something like motor unit recruitment in order to meet the challenge, to maximize my growth, and yada, yada, yada. And yeah, they get to be fun things to start to explore, and they're just not communicated very well, I don't think, in most of it. I don't know about you, but I find that most people communicating things like biomechanics or exercise physiology essentially seem to have swallowed a thesaurus and have just started just using the most complex language to describe stuff. And there's a time and a place for that. Like, if you want to talk mathematically, we can, but that's not useful to most people. Can I show it with a visual demonstration? That's the cool thing with crane scales and stuff where you can see numbers. You're like, there it is. Now, if you want to know why, we can talk about the ins and outs. But can I come up with an analogy? Can I show you it? Can I put it in plain language that we can all grasp onto, so I don't have to sit down and try and decipher for half an hour what the fuck you just said before I can agree or disagree or rephrase it?
It's exactly right. I actually did the complete series on my Instagram post of just breaking down complex language that you probably see across, exercise physiologists and those that claim that they know something about biomechanics and all that sort of stuff. It's just like,
I enjoyed the phrase, those that claim.
It's like, well, it's like they say this, so this is what they really mean. It's just like, it's really that simple. Here's the really example. Yeah.
And I don't know whether it's a bunch of people who don't really understand what they're saying, but they're kind of I suspect arguably it's a lot of that, or whether that's the only way they know how to communicate it, because they haven't really thought about it well enough to be like, how would I explain this to someone else who has no background in this? I don't know. I'm not entirely sure why this is turning into the case. Or is it because, essentially on one level, we're just lifting weights, right? Yeah. Which is, kind of like caveman, like, we just move this thing. It's not that, on one level, it's not that complicated, right? Yeah. And so we want to make ourselves sound more professional and more serious. And so if we use these fancy words where a simple word would do, right? You will use the fancy one. Like, you don't need to. So I suspect it's probably a combination of all those things, depending on the person communicating.
I think also in this day and age on social media, especially, people trying to promote to get their own clients online and that sort of stuff, to try to differentiate themselves from everybody else. So they start playing with the higher caliber words, and we just sort of sit there like, look, I know what you're saying, and I'm just going to break it down.
Yeah, but I think really a large amount of people then do this thing where I think we are, as a species, impressed by the complex more than the simple.
And the simple,
and so when someone says something in a complicated way, even if we don't understand it, we're like, well, that sounded way more impressive and sciencey than this dude over here.
And 9 times out of 10, it's bloody wrong.
Yeah, exactly. But I don't know how we solve that kind of thing, because then I don't know about you, but most people don't feel confident asking a question on something if they don't really understand it. And just to put their hand up and be like, I have no idea what you just said. What the fuck? There's going to be some, but a lot of people will just sit there quietly because they'll think everyone else is understanding what he's just said there. I must be the moron.
Yeah, I must be the problem. Yeah.
And it's like, no, I promise you're probably not. Having been teaching this in person and stuff for a little while, most people are confused. And that job is okay. How do we present this sort of information in a way that isn't terrifying? Because the last thing we want it to be is fucking scary. Okay, there's some things to get your head around, and there's a challenge in there, and you're not going to learn it in a day, and that's fine. There's nothing that you're any good at that's worth being good at that you're going to be good at in a day. But it also, look, you live in the physical world. You navigate it successfully, hopefully, most of the time. You get down the stairs, you open the door, you lift the dumbbell. We're talking about a world that you have a physical experience in. And so the best way we can communicate that is, how do I create a physical experience for you that you can compare it to your previous experiences? And you're like, oh, that's different. And if we can get that moment of, oh, okay, cool, I've got you. Now we can go kind of explore. In the in-person stuff, one of the examples I always use for the beginner courses is, I'll get everyone around and we're like, right, who reckons they can do a lat raise with this giant 2.5 kilo dumbbell? And everyone looks at me like, this feels like a trap.
Yeah.
So I don't want to. And you're like, what? You guys don't reckon you could lift a 2.5 kilo dumbbell? And then everyone starts looking at each other. So I'll usually then pick on the biggest dude in the room. And be like, do you not? You're telling me you can't lift a 2.5 kilo dumbbell? So, yeah, I'm pretty sure I could lift it. All right, okay, cool. Come out here. So they'll come out. And then I will bring out, where I've attached in preparation for this moment, a 2.5 kilo dumbbell, but I've attached it to the end of a broom that's really long. And I'm like, right, lat raise this. And sure enough, he tries to go,
yes.
Can't get it, because again, we're not just dealing with that dumbbell, we're dealing with the distance that dumbbell is away from the axis again. And I don't care how strong you are. You can bring me Eddie Hall or Hafthor Bjornsson or whoever you like. If you get me a long enough broom, I will embarrass him with a 1 kilo dumbbell.
Yeah, 100%.
Do you know what I mean? That's one of the fun moments. But that's a way better moment for people to see and to experience, to go, oh, there is something here beyond just the dumbbell weight. And if you can find those moments, I think that's what gets the buy-in for people to want to explore further and start to see these bits and pieces. And that's way better than me saying that in complex language. It doesn't need to be put in complex language. You already understand some of this stuff from your actual life experience. You just might not know what we call half of those bits and pieces yet. But you kind of know it somewhere inside you. You have some intuitive feel for it at this point because, well, you've spent a life living in the physical world and it's governed by these rules. And so let's start to uncover them so you can use, we call it making the invisible visible. There's all these invisible forces going on, but you can start to see them once you get some familiarity, like, oh, it wants to go down. There's this invisible almost line of force that this thing is going on and it's trying to turn an axis that's here. So if that's the case, where would it take it? What muscles are well lined up to fight that guy? Cool. And let's run it from there. But yeah, I have a hatred of overly complex language. I guess I'm just, not because we can't use it, because it's just not needed.
No, exactly right. I mean, the people reading it don't need to read those complex words. And it's like I've always said, like Einstein, like, if you can't explain it to a 6-year-old or an 8-year-old, you don't know it well enough. Don't. So, yeah. Yeah.
And obviously there's some moments where that breaks down, right? Like if you really want to, like, 6-year-olds, there's a rare 6-year-old who's doing calculus. Fair enough. But the principle of, like, you want to aim for simplicity where you can. You don't get bonus points for making something more complicated than it needs to be. I want to make it as simple as possible and no more. And sometimes as simple as possible is still moderately complicated and it's going to take you a while to get. But often it fucking ain't. And let's get to that. Let's prize that. Let's really, I don't want to say reward that, because on one level, Instagram rewards what is well communicated and what is well put together and stuff as it is, because you're exposing this stuff to a big audience. If no one's engaging with it, you ain't communicating it very well, or you're putting it in front of the wrong audience or something. So there is already a gauge of those bits and pieces. But if I've managed to get any traction over the last year or two for these things, I'd like to think it's probably because of hopefully an ability to start communicating some of these things in a way where you go, oh, okay, I get that. I can understand that. I can bring some Meccano out, make a little model, show you what I'm talking about. And like, see, it goes here. And you're like, I can get that. I can see it. I can
exactly.
see it.
Even if I don't fully, it makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. Even if I don't fully get, and I couldn't calculate why, I can see that it's true.
Yeah.
And okay, cool. I get that. And you can run from there.
Completely agree. I actually wanted to touch on, I don't know how long this will take because I feel like we're going to go for a while now. Range of motion. I know we share a very similar opinion, and why we need to standardize range of motion when people and humans aren't standard or come in standard shapes.
Yeah, that's quite right, isn't it? You're like, if human beings themselves aren't standardized, why on earth would we expect there to be a standardized range of motion? We also get to start thinking like, range of motion of what exactly? Like, historically, it's always been of some external object going some predetermined distance, right? Which isn't itself standardized, predetermined. It's, how far does that bar travel on a bench press before it hits my chest? Isn't the same for everyone. If you've got really long arms, it's not the same as someone who's got T-Rex arms. If you've got a big giant rib cage or you've got, fake boobs going on, that thing isn't going to have to travel as far as if you've got a really small, long, gangly human who looks like some kind of like pigeon, right? Those two people are really experiencing different things. And in physics terms, the work done by something is equal to the force times the distance it travels. And well, the distance it travels ain't the same. So the work done by those two people isn't the same. And we haven't even looked internally at what starts happening to the ability of something like the pec to actually generate rotary force in the shoulder as people go into different positions. Some people, when they're in the bottom of a bench press or a chest press of whatever kind, are in a really mechanically efficient position for their chest to be like, sweet, I can push this up. They're generally barrel-shaped, big people who are like, of course the bench press grows the chest. And then there's going to be other people who, and I'm more like this, I'm kind of long and gangly-ish by nature, who the bench press just starts burning the shoulders after a fair little while. And yet these big dudes keep insisting that's what you've got to do. And a few years ago, if you weren't programming squat, bench and dead for everyone, were you really even a coach? No, you basically got kicked out of the association. And so, I spent 8 years of a trainer before I started coming across this stuff, believing the same kind of things. And it doesn't matter whether Doris came in at 79 years old. Yep. She was benching for 20 years. Everyone was benching, right? Benching was the rule.
And it was bar to chest every time.
100%. Otherwise, that didn't count as a rep.
Yeah, exactly.
And so, okay, that's one, but the forces these people are exposed to aren't the same between those things. Or a squat, everyone knows a squat goes arse to grass. That is the phrase. We all learned it. Hamstrings have to touch the calf and what have you. But not everyone folds up under a squat all that well. I try and imagine, again, we can use an accordion where all the segment lengths are kind of the same, and they fold up really well, up and down, happy days. They look like, Rich Froning under a squat. They look like an Olympic weightlifter. Yeah. Sweet. They can sit all the way down to the floor. They generally, by the way, have quite a long torso segment, a relatively short femur segment, moderately long tibial, like floor to shin, floor to knee kind of segment. And they fold up really well when squatting. And then you were to take someone who is 7 feet tall and you get them to squat and they're in the NBA and shit, it doesn't look the same for some reason. They look like someone made a Chinese menu that wasn't all the same length. So one part of the menu is like really short, the other one is jagged and sticking out miles, and then another bit's the different length. And when this thing folds up, there's paper sticking out one end and the other, and it just doesn't fold up neatly like an accordion or like a Chinese menu is supposed to fold up. And there's no consideration for that. And that really means that when we look at those forces that we're applying to someone in something like the squat, how much force does it expose the hip to, the knee to, the low back to? That is all going to be dependent on how well we fold up. We call this segmental proportion. It's just a fancy way of saying how long are each of these bits in relationship to each other. And foldability, which is an okay word because doesn't sound complex and describes what it is. How well do you fold up, right? Without a consideration of those guys, we can't say what forces this person is being exposed to. Like, why is it that when this person squats, they grow their quads really well? And so for them, They program for everyone. This person wants to grow their legs. Squat.
It's
got to be squats. They work for me. Why are you not getting lower? And then yet for this other person, crap, their back just starts aching, and maybe their groin aches a little bit every time they get above 100 kilos for some reps. And then they get a little niggle and an injury, so they have to step back a bit, and they come back determined to keep squatting because, again, you have to squat. So off they kind of go, and they just repeat this cycle of wear and tear and not really ever growing what they wanted to grow. And yet we can answer that question of, oh yeah, for Tim over here, this exercise is a big hip challenge and a very minimal knee challenge or quad challenge. And it's actually got quite a big talk to all of those spinal erectors. And Tim has a bit of a weak back from a history of doing a bunch of stuff that didn't suit him or exceeding ranges of motion that he couldn't get into. And so, maybe I need a different thing for Tim. And so we start to kind of play with that, because within range of motion, we've just touched on an external performance. We could look at, is it the internal range? And when we reach a certain joint angle, that's when that thing kind of stops. We could kind of potentially play with that. We've also got things that we might term active range of motion and a passive range of motion. And really active for me just means, can I get there under my own muscular contraction? And passive meaning anything beyond that. And so if we were doing a push-up, a push-up, your wrist needs to get to basically 90 degrees with the floor, right? I know there's pretty much as a minimum, unless you use push-up handles.
Yes.
But if you were to take your own arm in front of you and go, can I pull my wrist back to 90 degrees with straight fingers and all that stuff? For me, I can't. I can get about halfway. But if I use my other hand or the floor, I can shove it into that 90-degree position, and I could do so. But I'm going to a position there that quite clearly my forearm extensors, the guys that pull my wrist into that position, they're not capable of getting me there for at least at this point. Now, maybe with enough work and some practice, I might be able to get to that position, of course. But right now, I can't. And so I go into that position, and those muscles aren't enough to hold that thing. So I'm starting to now hang out on what we might call soft tissue a little bit. I'm going to start wearing away possibly a little bit at the joint capsule, if there's bursa kicking around, if there's ligament, if there's all the soft tissue stuff that doesn't actively produce force. And by actively produce force, I mean it spends energy to do it. So when we contract a muscle, we have to spend this thing called ATP. Fundamentally, at the end of it, we have to spend some calories to contract these guys. Passive stuff doesn't require caloric expenditure to do it. A corpse still produces passive tension, right? And passive tension stuff you can think of like elastic bands. Right? If you stretch an elastic band, it snaps back. As a consequence of the tissue structure, it wants to come back to a certain resting length. Yeah. And so passive stuff will always kind of pull back. It is producing force, but it isn't that muscular contraction. It's hanging out on the other bits. Now, is that a problem? Well, I don't know necessarily. Like, how far beyond the end of your active range have you taken it? Under what level of force? If you've taken it just past your active range under a very small force, probably isn't going to do all that much. Your body is quite resilient. But if you're taking it quite a long way past and it's under big load, and you do that rep after rep after rep after rep for decades, that's a very different thing. Yeah. And so we start to possibly see, again, more wear and tear. And we're not going to see that in research because this study has funding for 8 weeks, 10 weeks, 12 weeks.
Yeah, not 8 to 10
right?
years.
Yeah, not exactly. There isn't a study that's ever going to be done on that because, well, cancer's a thing and it's better to fund that than whether or not, do you know what, the bench press for these jack dudes turned out over 10 years to be a bit worse than if we stopped. It's not going to happen. It just isn't going to happen. So we shouldn't expect that in the research. And I think that's okay for us to accept that and respect that. But it doesn't mean there isn't a consequence. And maybe the best analogy I've got for it, and I steal this from Tom Purvis, the head of the RTS, resistance training specialist. If you're not familiar with him, guys, you should check him out. He kind of talks about driving around a mountain pass, right? The kind of mountain road where there's a rail that, you know, stops you driving off the cliff. Yep. And you're in your car. And the best way of you driving around the mountain road is to use the steering wheel and to stay within the lane, to stay within the ranges you can control and turn around and we're going this way and that way. Fine. There is another way of driving that mountain pass, and that is to let go of the steering wheel and just drive into the rail and let the rail steer you around the road. Now, that's going to wear away at the car and it's going to wear away at the rail. But you could do it at least for a period of time. Depends how aggressively you drive at the rail. If you drive flat out, you might just go through the rail or over it. If I go way beyond the range I can control under huge load, something's going to pop out, break, it's going to go badly. That's how sporting injuries occur. We exceeded the tolerance or range or something, and off it went. So that's driving through the rail. But we could see slower wear or tear at the edge of the car, and the front of my car's getting all fucked up and there's rails all grazed. So maybe my joint capsule and my labrum is wearing away because I'm not steering around the road that I can stay in. I'm just going beyond it. Then we add in a little genetic capacity within this kind of stuff, right? Some people can seemingly set themselves on fire for year after year after year, and they seem to tolerate it. And other people aren't that. And often the genetic freaks, the athletes of the world, the people who write the programs, the people with the giant following on Instagram because they've got phenomenal genes for this stuff, they can tolerate a whole bunch of shit that most of your clients and probably most of you listening to this can't tolerate. So you keep trying it, it just keeps breaking down and kind of hurting. And it's like, okay, maybe we don't need to do that. But wrapping it kind of back up, it's if structure dictates function, an old kind of engineering architectural term, and the structures aren't the same person to person, why on earth would we expect the ranges of motion that we go through to be the same for people? And then the consequences for exceeding them are going to depend on forces, depend on genetics, depend on how far we go beyond that, et cetera, et cetera. It's a bit like, probably best analogy I've got for exceeding tolerance is a suntan. Like, you often don't know if you burnt yourself, you slightly overdid it till the next day. It's, you got out there, you think, I think I'm okay. And then the next day you're like, I'm a bit I've kind of overdone that. I'm a bit red. Now, if you really overdid it, you'll know on the same day. But you went way past tolerance if you do it on the same day. Yeah. So for a lot of these things, we aren't going to know whether we're exceeding the volume you should lift, the range you should do, until maybe a bit later. And it might be the next day or a day or two, or it could actually take a fair while before these issues start to manifest. I'm like, fuck me, my shoulder aches or this hurts. So there's plenty of stuff to explore with range of motion, but it does mean we really can't standardize it to any great degree, which is annoying because, again, science needs to standardize things. So I get why we wanted to, but it doesn't mean it was right to do so.
Yeah, no, like I said, I completely agree. As we spoke off camera, don't see why people try to standardize something when, the things that you're trying to standardize aren't standard. So,
100%. It's like, if a meter, I use this analogy when talking about volume, and if one rep isn't the same as another rep based on the machine we're using, the speed we lift it out, whatever, well, how do we really standardize volume? Right. But the same thing is true of range of motion. If you don't have a standardized measure, you can't measure something effectively. If I was like, Steve is 7 meters tall because my meter is, the length of my hand. And he turns up and you're like, Paul told me Steve was 7 meters tall and he's clearly 5'7". It's like, but this is my meter. It's my hand over here. It's like, no, that's not what a meter is. This is a meter. And they bring out a meter rule. You have to have a standardized measure of something in order to measure anything else by it. And if we don't have that, we can't really have a conversation. And that's one of the issues with range.
I can completely agree. It's always a fun conversation to have and watch people's minds sort of just wander off when you start to explain it. And they're like, I didn't even think about it like that. Like, there's a lot going on.
And by the way, I've fallen for every single one of these things over the year.
For sure. We all have. This
is my 11th year as a PT, and I've done every dumb thing you could probably possibly think of across the course of this career.
I feel like those that have only lasted because they've done the dumb shit and they've learned from the dumb shit that they've done. The
first class that I ever took, I threw a med ball into a girl's face and made her nosebleed. First ever class. I was demonstrating like a chest pass, which decided apparently needed to be in my circuit. And I was like, ready, catch, smash. She starts crying, her nose is bleeding. I'm like, this is the worst start to a thing. I fell off a Bosu ball in front of a class once where I was like, well, Bosu, because obviously we needed to squat on Bosu balls back in the day.
100%. They were the thing for stability.
Yeah, 100%. I remember doing a superset of a leg press stable into a non-stable. Bosu squat, that was super important work.
Yes.
I've not had carbs after 3 p.m. Recommended that people take a gram of fish oil per percent of body fat, which is real difficult if you've got an obese client and they're like 35% body fat. You're like, I guess you're going to need a jar of fish oil a day. You do half these things because you're like, oh, that makes sense. And again, we go back to someone can use some words that you can't yet, and it sounds about right. And it sounds complicated and compelling. So off you go. And it's one of the reasons I feel quite passionately about more clarity in speech in less complex ways is let's stop doing that. I could have saved myself a few years of dumb shit.
Yeah, well, I think between that and genuinely asking questions, it's like when you genuinely don't know, just ask it. There's no wrong question. There's no bad question. Just ask it. It's the best thing, being able to ask people, when you don't know something. And it's something that I come across with a lot of coaches, and sort of something that I preach to coaches as well. It's okay not to know something. Just simply say you don't know, because you have that ability to learn something new. So
100%. There's literally nothing wrong with that. And it's a much better place to search for that clarity. And because no one knows everything, not even close. And to have that humility to be like, cool, I don't know this. Let's go seek out some people who do, and then feel like we're improving at that thing. We all feel more confident as we improve, as our competence improves. Like if you want to get over imposter syndrome, which is a super common thing for people to have, the best way of doing it is to get better at what you do. And the best way and the fastest way of doing that is to go hang out with people, spend time with people who are already good at what you do, who kind of are where you want to be. And, the more I spent money doing those types of courses and going on that thing, the faster my career developed, the more money I earned myself as a coach, the better I felt about my skill set. It's kind of win-win-win, really. Yeah. Because when you start out, there's so much that you don't know. There's still so much that I don't know, that you don't. There's still so much, every single one of us in one area or not, there's things we still don't know about. And that kind of keeps us engaged, because if you knew it all, it'd be really boring.
I was going to say, yeah, it's like when people say something's perfect. It's like if everybody's perfect, by definition, nobody's perfect. It's quite boring.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Well, I was going to say, normally when I wrap up, I tend to ask one question, and it seems to stump a lot of guests that I've had on this podcast, which is quite interesting considering we all live in the social media world. Three Instagram accounts you follow that seem to better your day, whether it be education, humor, whatever it is.
It's a good question. Mark Manson, I think, is worth a follow for most people. He's a great writer. If you're familiar with Stoicism or Nietzsche and a whole bunch of philosophical ideas, he's not necessarily new, but what he does do very well is package it in his storytelling capacity in a way that if you aren't interested in reading Seneca and Epictetus or Thus Spoke Zarathustra from the original, which could be harder work, he's awesome at doing that. Something like The Subtle Art of Not Giving a Fuck, which is a great title and just a really good read, is useful. And his Instagram page is really similar, I think, to that. So he would be one on that. I don't know if you guys know Paul Alima. His Instagram page is Alima Omega, I think. Big, giant black dude from the UK who is the funniest guy. All of his stuff is just ripping the piss for the most part about influencers or fitnessy stuff and just dumb things. And almost everyone is a hit. Everyone is super funny. So he's great for that. Actually, here's another one that's not well known, and he's an Aussie guy. I think his name is Tom Candy. Let me just search this guy real quick, because he's like a musician comedian from Tom Cardy. Yep. And he just does comedy-ish skit songs, plays a whole bunch of music. He's a very good musician, and he's just really funny, and they're interesting and good. So probably let's go with those three. Mark Manson for some philosophical insight, Paul Alimas for ripping the fitness industry, and Tom Cardy for just putting out some very cool and funny musical shit would probably be the three that whenever there's something they put out, I'll stop and have a little read.
Yeah, right. Well, that's actually, out of all the guests, you've answered that the fastest, and with the least difficult or difficulty.
Well, if you can't answer that question relatively well, you should maybe question what you follow.
Well, a lot of them seem to say like, "Oh, I don't scroll much." It's like, come on, you're
You're a fucking liar. Yes, you do.
Yeah, you're a liar. No, I agree. And I said that to my coach, Joe, as well. I'm just like, mate, come on. Don't lie.
Unless you're one of those people who like, I followed 7 people, I unfollowed everyone, and I've got 500,000 followers. And so I just don't, because otherwise I can maybe see that. But most people, exactly. You've got 8,000 followers, you've got 10,000, you've got 20,000. You're not that popular that you need to unfollow
follow everyone. Right?
Yeah, exactly. You just seem like a bit of a cock. So you spend some time scrolling Instagram, don't you, lie to me? So, and if you don't, what are you saying to your audience about Instagram?
Well, exactly right. Yeah, exactly right.
I wouldn't
the other
use
side of it.
What, even for your own stuff? Nah, I just wouldn't use it. I think Instagram's shit. But follow me though, because my stuff's great. Right?
Great. Yeah, exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for jumping on, my friend, and it was a great chat, man. And hopefully the listeners get something out of it. As always, I know I do when I have guests on this podcast, so I'm very thankful for you to jump on.
Thanks for having me, dude.
I'm sure we will catch up soon.
Amen.
Thank you.